After losing her husband, Erin Walsh stopped living. Gaze blended together. The TV hummed in the background, and the empty chair across from her stayed untouched. She ignored calls from friends and left meals half-eaten. One afternoon, a flyer slid under her door. Healing through connection, a grief support circle. She didn't plan to go, but something about the word connection felt like oxygen. That's where she met Julian Hart, the man who smiled like he understood loss better than anyone. She had no idea his version of healing could lead people to their graves. Erin sat in her kitchen staring at a photo of her late husband. The frame had dust along the edges, just like everything else in the house. Her coffee was cold, but she didn't bother reheating it. Outside, kids played on bikes, their laughter faint through the thin walls. She envied their noise, their life. For her, days were quiet, the kind that swallowed you whole. When she picked up the flyer again, she felt embarrassed for even considering it. Yet deep inside, a small voice whispered that maybe sitting in a room full of pain wouldn't feel so lonely. That Thursday, she stood outside the community center door longer than she should have. The walls were beige, the kind you find in places that try too hard to feel safe. She smelled coffee and cleaning spray from inside. Her hands trembled slightly as she pushed the door open. A few people sat in a circle, eyes tired but kind. No one spoke much. Erin took a seat near the edge, planning to listen quietly. Then Julian Hart entered, his presence calm, almost calculated. He smiled at each of them like he'd known their pain before they arrived. Julian introduced himself as the group counselor, his tone practiced but gentle. Erin noticed how everyone seemed drawn to him. Even the air shifted when he spoke. He didn't talk about moving on. Instead, he talked about rebirth. His words were soft, almost hypnotic, and when he asked Erin to share something, she froze. But his gaze stayed patient. Against her own will, she spoke about missing her husband's voice. When she finished, Julian said she was brave. It was a small comment, but it landed like approval from someone whose opinion mattered more than it should. After the session ended, Julian lingered. People thanked him and left slowly, some hugging him before leaving. Erin tried to slip out quietly, but he caught her eye and smiled. He thanked her for speaking up, said her honesty could help others. His tone was smooth, too smooth, but she felt flattered. That night she couldn't stop replaying the sound of his voice in her head. She told herself it was only gratitude, nothing else. Yet for the first time in months, she went to bed without crying. The ache didn't disappear, but it felt slightly quieter. The next morning, sunlight filled the kitchen, and Erin noticed it. That alone surprised her. She made coffee and even opened a window. The air smelled fresh, mixed with cut grass from the neighbor's yard. When she looked at the clock, she realized she was already thinking about the next meeting. She didn't want to admit it, but she wanted to see Julian again. It wasn't about love or attraction. It was about being noticed, about someone making her feel she still existed in the world. That thought scared her more than she wanted to admit. At the second session, Julian greeted her first. His smile held recognition this time, a quiet acknowledgement. He talked about grief as energy that needed direction, and everyone listened like he was preaching truth. Erin watched him more than she wanted to. He asked if anyone had tried writing letters to the ones they'd lost. She hadn't, but she said she might. When the meeting ended, Julian gave her a nod that felt personal. It was strange how much weight one simple gesture could carry when you'd been invisible for so long. Erin began writing that night. She sat by the kitchen table, the same one where her husband once read the newspaper, and started her letter. At first her words came out awkward. Then they poured faster, like she'd been waiting for permission to say them. She wrote until her hand cramped. By the end she felt drained but lighter. She folded the letter and placed it beside the photo on the counter. In her chest something shifted. Not peace, exactly, but a strange pull toward whoever had made her believe healing was possible again. Julian began calling her by name during meetings, using her as an example of progress. It embarrassed her, but it also warmed her. People started noticing her too, nodding when she spoke. For the first time in years, she felt part of something. Julian talked about the stages of loss, but his eyes always seemed to linger on her a bit longer than necessary. Afterward, he offered to stay for anyone who wanted one-on-one guidance. Erin didn't stay, but her heart beat faster when he mentioned it. She told herself it was just nerves. On her walk home that evening, she noticed how different the world looked. The city lights reflected in puddles after rain, and she caught herself smiling. It had been months since she'd noticed small things like that. She passed a bakery window and remembered how her husband used to bring home her favorite cake. The thought stung, but it didn't break her. When she reached her apartment, she felt both comforted and unsettled. The meetings were helping her feel alive again, but she couldn't ignore how much of that feeling was tied to Julian himself. By the third week, Erin was no longer just another face in the group. Julian called her his example of strength, and everyone clapped. She felt awkward, though a small part of her enjoyed the attention. Julian gave her a notebook, saying it would help her organize her emotions. His handwriting on the first page read, "Healing requires surrender." The words repeated in her mind that night, as she filled the pages with memories she hadn't touched in years. She didn't realize it yet, but she was giving him everything he needed to know her weaknesses. During one session, Julian mentioned a smaller, advanced recovery group. He said it was for those ready to move past grief into renewal. Erin hesitated, unsure if she was ready, but when he looked at her and smiled, she said yes. The next meeting wasn't at the center. It was at his apartment downtown. That detail caught her off guard, but no one else seemed concerned. He said the setting was more personal, more freeing. Erin wanted to believe him. She didn't want to seem afraid of something that was supposed to help her heal. The night of the private group, Erin dressed more carefully than usual. She told herself it was just respect for the program. But she knew it was more than that. When she arrived, Julian opened the door himself. His apartment was spotless, filled with warm lighting, candles, and soft music. The air smelled faintly of honey and wood polish. He greeted her warmly and offered tea, his hand brushing hers for just a second too long. She felt awkward but didn't pull away. The setting was intimate, almost too comfortable for something called therapy. Only 3 other people attended the small group. They sat on floor cushions around Julian, who spoke about shedding pain. His words were smooth, practiced, like he'd said them 100 times before. He asked everyone to imagine releasing the past like smoke leaving their body. Erin closed her eyes and tried. For a brief moment she actually felt lighter. When she opened them, Julian was watching her. His expression wasn't professional. It was something else. Admiration, maybe ownership. She looked away, uneasy, but unsure why. Nothing in the room felt wrong, yet something inside her stirred. After the session, Julian asked Erin to stay behind. The others left quietly, thanking him as they went. He poured her more tea and said she had a rare openness, something he could help her protect. His voice was lower now, more personal. Erin nodded, unsure how to respond. He told her to keep writing, to trust the process completely. On the way home, she couldn't shake his tone. It didn't sound like therapy anymore. It sounded like invitation disguised as care. Yet she told herself it was just her imagination. Grief can make people misread kindness. That night, Erin lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her husband's photo still sat on the nightstand, but she turned it face down without meaning to. She kept replaying Julian's words, how she was ready to move forward. It felt both empowering and dangerous. The next morning she dressed early, planning her day around when she might see him again. Her world had shrunk to the size of that connection. She didn't know it yet, but she wasn't just healing under Julian's guidance. She was being studied, shaped, and slowly drawn into something far darker. Erin began checking her phone constantly, waiting for messages that never came. The silence between sessions started to feel heavier than her grief. She reread her journal, noticing how many pages were now filled with Julian's advice instead of her husband's memories. His words had replaced her own thoughts without her realizing it. When she caught herself smiling at the sound of his name, she felt embarrassed. But the embarrassment didn't stop her. She told herself that healing required trust, and Julian seemed to be the only person who understood what trust meant anymore. At the next meeting, Erin wore her hair differently. It wasn't planned. She just wanted to feel presentable. Julian noticed, and his eyes lingered a second longer than usual. He spoke that evening about transformation, how pain could turn into beauty. His tone was confident, warm, and everyone nodded along. Erin wondered how someone could talk about suffering without ever sounding broken. When the meeting ended, he thanked her again for being courageous. She walked home with a strange mix of pride and shame, unsure which emotion truly belonged to her. Julian began assigning personal tasks to certain members. He gave Erin one too, to let go of something that still tied her to her old life. She thought about her husband's clothes still hanging in the closet. That night, she packed them into boxes. It felt cruel, but freeing. When she told Julian later, he smiled and said she was ahead of most people. The praise hit deeper than she expected. She didn't see how each compliment was a thread he used to tie her closer, weaving trust around her like a quiet trap she couldn't see forming. The sessions became the only thing that mattered. Erin skipped lunch with friends, ignored calls from her sister, and rearranged her work schedule. Julian's voice filled every gap her husband had left behind. One afternoon, she caught herself writing his name in the corner of her notebook without meaning to. It startled her. She quickly scribbled it out, but the mark still showed faintly through the paper. When she looked up at her reflection in the window, she barely recognized herself. Healing was supposed to bring her back, yet she was slipping further into someone else's design. One woman from the group, Denise, often shared how Julian had changed her life. She said he helped her find peace through surrender. Her devotion was unsettling, almost like worship. Erin asked about the process, but Denise only smiled and said it couldn't be explained, only experienced. The following week, Denise didn't show up. Julian said she'd moved on to a higher level of healing. His words were vague, but everyone nodded. Erin wanted to ask where she went, but something in his calm expression made her stay quiet. Silence felt safer than curiosity in that room. That evening, Julian gave Erin a small jar wrapped in brown paper. He said it was imported honey from Greece, a gift for progress. She hesitated but accepted it, feeling awkward about the gesture. The honey sat on her nightstand for days. One night, she tasted a spoonful before bed. It was smooth and floral, strangely comforting. From that night on, it became a quiet ritual. One spoon before sleep, like medicine for loneliness. She never noticed how much she'd started replacing real comfort with small things tied to Julian's approval. He had become the rhythm of her days. Erin started dreaming again. Her dreams weren't peaceful. They were strange, filled with flickering faces and voices she couldn't place. In one dream, she stood by a lake and heard the sound of a bell in the distance. When she told Julian about it, he said dreams were messages from the healing process. His explanation sounded rehearsed, but she wanted to believe it. Later that day, she searched online for the group's background but found nothing. No official listing, no records, not even his credentials. She brushed off the unease, convincing herself trust meant not questioning. One morning, Erin noticed a red thread tangled around her wrist. She didn't remember how it got there. Maybe from her sweater, she thought. Still, she couldn't shake the oddness of it. She tied it to the jar of honey on her nightstand, thinking it might remind her to stay grounded. Instead, it began to feel symbolic, like something connecting her to Julian even when he wasn't there. That night, she slept better. But deep down, she started to sense that every part of her life was being subtly arranged, and she was letting it happen willingly. The next small group session was quieter. Julian spoke about fear as the final stage of release. Erin watched the other two attendees, both women nodding like they already understood. Julian's attention stayed mostly on her though. When she shared that she sometimes felt uncertain about moving on, he said that meant she was ready to shed the last of her resistance. His tone was firm but kind. She smiled and nodded, trying to please him. The other women left quickly afterward, avoiding eye contact. Erin wondered what they saw that she didn't, but she pushed the thought away. Julian began texting her, short messages about reflection and mindfulness. At first, she thought it was part of the group support. Then the tone shifted, subtle compliments, gentle reminders that she was special. Erin told herself it was harmless, but she started dressing with more care for sessions. She even checked her phone in the middle of the night, hoping for his messages. The attention filled a space grief had carved out long ago. She didn't realize yet that what felt like connection was actually control, one carefully measured word at a time. Erin's sister Nora called to check in. She mentioned she hadn't heard from Erin in weeks. Erin said she was fine, that the group was helping. Nora asked if the counselor was licensed, and Erin brushed it off. The call ended quickly, but afterward, Erin felt strangely defensive, almost protective of Julian. That night, she reread her journal entries and noticed how much space his name took up, more than her husband's now. The realization should have scared her. Instead, she told herself it was proof she was healing, learning to attach again, even if to the wrong person. At the next meeting, Julian announced a weekend healing retreat. He said it was optional, a chance for deeper reflection. Erin's pulse quickened at the thought. Denise's name briefly came up again, and Julian said she'd attended a similar retreat before moving forward. His tone was final, shutting down curiosity. Erin signed up anyway, convincing herself she needed closure. That evening, Julian texted her privately, saying he was proud of her commitment. She stared at the message for an hour before replying with a simple thank you. The line between trust and dependency had already disappeared. The retreat took place in a remote cabin surrounded by pine trees. The setting was quiet. Too quiet. Julian greeted her with the same calm charm, offering her tea as soon as she arrived. The other attendees were few, 2 women, both distant and obedient around him. The first night, Julian told them to write letters to their lost loved ones and burn them. Erin hesitated but obeyed. Watching the paper curl and darken felt final. He called it rebirth through flame. She didn't see the flicker of satisfaction behind his smile as she let her letter burn away. That night, Julian sat beside her near the fireplace, talking about letting go completely. His words were soft, almost hypnotic. He said she carried purity in her pain, and that surrender could make her whole again. Erin didn't know what he meant, but her heart pounded at the intimacy in his tone. When his hand brushed hers, she didn't pull away. Later, when she went to her room, she told herself it was only comfort. But deep inside, something had shifted. She wasn't sure if she was healing anymore, or just becoming something Julian wanted her to be. The next morning, Julian acted distant, like the connection between them never happened. He focused on the others, speaking about clarity and focus. Erin felt confused and slightly ashamed. She told herself it was her imagination, that maybe she'd misread everything. When they left the retreat, he thanked her for her trust. His eyes said something different, something she couldn't name. The drive home felt long and hollow. She wanted to believe she was getting better, but a quiet unease had started forming in the spaces where comfort used to live. Before we continue and uncover what Erin begins to find about Julian's healing, make sure to stay with this story till the end. You won't believe what she discovers next. Back home, Erin opened her journal and stared at the empty page. For the first time, she couldn't write. Every word felt forced, every thought confused. The honey jar sat beside her, the red thread wrapped neatly around its lid. She touched it absent-mindedly, realizing how strange the habit had become. She thought about calling Nora, but shame stopped her. She didn't know what to say. that she'd fallen for a man who spoke like a therapist but felt like temptation. Instead, she closed the journal and decided she'd figure things out alone. At the next group session, Julian acted normal, as if the retreat never happened. Aaron watched him closely this time. He smiled at everyone, told the same stories, repeated the same phrases about renewal. It felt scripted, like watching a performance she'd already seen too many times. Afterward, one woman pulled Aaron aside. Her name was Marla, and her voice trembled when she said Julian had been too involved with others before. Aaron's stomach turned, but she stayed silent. When she turned to look for Julian, he was already watching them from across the room. That night, Aaron searched Julian's name online. Nothing came up except an old community post about emotional wellness sessions. No website, no records, no credentials. It was as if he existed only inside that small circle. She searched for Denise too, but there were no updates, no new posts, no photos, nothing. Her social media ended the month she joined the group. Aaron tried to dismiss the thought that maybe she wasn't the first person Julian had chosen to heal. But the idea lingered, twisting inside her chest until it turned into quiet dread. Rain began tapping against the window, steady and rhythmic. Aaron watched it, remembering the retreat by the fire. She could almost hear Julian's voice, telling her to let go of fear. But the words felt hollow now. She poured a spoonful of honey into tea, staring as it sank to the bottom. It was too sweet, almost sickening. She pushed it aside and walked away. Something about all of it, the red thread, the missing people, the polished charm, started fitting together in a way she didn't want to see. A few days later, police cars appeared on the news near the lake outside town. A body had been found. The anchor mentioned a woman in her late 30s, no family nearby, identified only through a grief recovery program she'd attended months earlier. Aaron's hand froze on the remote. The photo flashed for a second. Denise. Her throat tightened, her breath shallow. Julian's words about moving forward echoed in her head. She turned off the TV, sitting in silence for a long time. For the first time, she wasn't sure she was grieving the right person anymore. Julian canceled the next session, sending a short message saying the group needed time for reflection. Aaron reread it again and again. Reflection from what? She wanted to ask, but she didn't. Instead, she opened the notebook he'd given her and flipped to the first page. Healing requires surrender. The sentence now looked sinister. She closed it and put it away. That night, she dreamed of the lake again. The same sound of a bell carried through the fog, but this time someone was calling her name from beneath the water. The following week, the meetings resumed. Julian entered the room quieter than usual, but his composure never slipped. He spoke about tragedy as a reminder of impermanence. His calmness unnerved everyone. Aaron watched him closely, looking for cracks. She noticed how carefully he chose his words, how often he avoided mentioning Denise by name. When he finally made eye contact, she forced herself to hold his gaze. He smiled faintly as if nothing between them had changed. But Aaron knew something had. She just didn't yet know what to do about it. She decided to stay close to him, pretending nothing was wrong. She laughed at his jokes, volunteered for tasks, and nodded at everything he said. The act made her stomach twist, but she needed to understand him. That evening, she walked past his office after everyone left and saw his coat still hanging inside. On the desk was a small stack of photos. She only caught a glimpse before leaving. All women, all smiling, all familiar. Aaron went home shaking. She knew then she wasn't imagining it. Something dark connected every one of those faces. Aaron printed the news report about Denise's death and folded it into her notebook. The next day, she asked Julian if the lake reminded him of peace. His eyes flickered for half a second before his calm smile returned. He said water was where old selves dissolve. The answer chilled her. That night, she replayed his words in her head while the rain beat against the windows. The bell's sound echoed in her memory again. that low, distant chime that always seemed to follow her thoughts of him. She wasn't sure anymore if it was memory or warning. Erin began to plan quietly. She deleted her text messages with him, backed up her journal entries, and hid her phone recordings inside a file labeled recipes. She didn't know what proof she was searching for yet, only that she needed it. The next group session would be her test, to see if Julian trusted her as much as she pretended to trust him. She rehearsed her calm smile in the mirror, the same kind he used. In that reflection, she saw a woman learning to play his game, but this time she planned to win. Erin arrived early to the next session, sitting near the center of the circle instead of the edge. She wanted to study Julian closely, to watch the small details most people missed. He entered the room with the same calm charm, but she noticed something new, the pause before his smile, as if rehearsing it. When he spoke about rebirth, she could almost hear the performance behind the words. His control was perfect, but she saw the cracks now. Every gesture felt measured. Every look at her came with silent calculation, not care. She finally understood the act. After the meeting, Julian asked if she'd stay behind. His tone was friendly, but there was a firmness beneath it. Erin agreed, pretending curiosity. He talked about trust, saying that real healing came from obedience to the process. The words made her uneasy, yet she smiled politely. He suggested another one-on-one reflection at his apartment, saying she was close to her final stage. Erin agreed again, though her stomach turned. She left feeling like she had just signed something she couldn't read, a silent contract between predator and prey, though he didn't realize who was which yet. At home, Erin prepared carefully. She charged her phone, deleted old files, and installed a hidden recording app. Her hands stayed steady, which surprised her. The fear had changed into focus. She opened her journal and read her old letters, noticing how easily she'd let him guide her words. Every page felt like a map of manipulation. When she reached the one about surrender, she tore it out and burned it in the sink. The flame climbed high for a second before dying down. She watched the ashes swirl away, feeling lighter but colder than she'd ever felt before. The next evening, she arrived at Julian's apartment. The candles were lit again, the same soft music playing. He offered tea, smiling in that calm, magnetic way. Erin pretended to relax, her phone camera propped discreetly on her bag facing him. He talked about fear as resistance, encouraging her to release it completely. She nodded and listened, but her mind was racing. Every phrase sounded like repetition, lines delivered by someone who believed his own lies. When he reached to touch her hand, she let him. She needed him to trust her again, at least for now. He leaned closer, speaking softly about the connection they shared. His voice dropped lower, words turning more personal. Erin didn't pull away, but her heart was pounding with purpose, not affection. She watched his eyes carefully, the flicker of pride, the hunger for control. He thought she was falling deeper, but she was cataloging everything. He told her to close her eyes and breathe, to let him guide her through release. She followed his instructions, pretending calm. Behind her eyelids, she counted the seconds, waiting for the moment when she'd finally have enough proof to end this game. When the session ended, Julian told her she'd made a breakthrough. His tone was triumphant, like he'd accomplished something great. Erin smiled politely, thanked him, and left. Outside, the cold night air hit her face like a reminder of reality. She checked the recording on her phone. His voice clear, every manipulative phrase captured perfectly. She didn't feel relief, only resolve. On her way home, she noticed how the city lights looked sharper, like the world had regained edges she hadn't seen in months. The illusion was breaking, and beneath it, something darker was waiting to surface. The next day, Erin met Marla at a cafe. They sat by the window, speaking in low tones. Marla admitted that Julian had once invited her to a retreat too, but became aggressive when she refused. Erin showed her the recording. Marla's face went pale. They decided to gather proof together. Erin sent Marla copies of the files, promising to dig further. As she left, she saw Julian's reflection in the cafe glass across the street. Or thought she did. Her heart skipped, but when she turned, no one was there. Still, she walked faster, not looking back. Erin spent hours researching online again, this time with sharper focus. She cross-checked missing person reports with therapy listings, scanning for familiar names. 2 other women surfaced, both widows, both attendees of unregistered healing programs. One had vanished after a lakeside retreat, another after private sessions. She printed the reports, marking the details with red ink. It was all too consistent to be coincidence. The pattern stretched back years, hidden beneath comforting language and soft smiles. Erin stared at the papers spread across her table and realized the grief group wasn't therapy. It was a hunting ground. That night, Erin sat near her window, listening to rain. The honey jar sat untouched now, the red thread wrapped around its lid. She wondered how many women before her had believed the same promises. The sound of a distant bell echoed faintly through the storm, like something calling from far away. She thought of Denise, of her kind smile during that first meeting. Erin whispered an apology she couldn't explain. Then she turned off the light and waited, knowing that facing Julian again would be the most dangerous thing she'd ever done. But it was necessary. The next morning, Julian texted her to meet him privately again. He said they needed to discuss her emotional progress. Erin's hands tightened on the phone, but she replied yes. She could feel the trap closing, yet she knew the only way out was through. She spent the day preparing. Phone charged, notes ready, contacts informed. Her plan wasn't perfect, but it was enough to expose him. She thought about her husband, and how he used to say courage was just fear in motion. For the first time, she understood exactly what that meant. Erin arrived at his apartment once more. The same faint smell of honey and candle wax lingered in the air. Julian greeted her with warmth, as if nothing unusual existed between them. He complimented her energy, her openness, his tone dripping with practiced care. Erin smiled and played along. As he spoke, she noticed something strange. A stack of papers on his desk, bound with a red thread. She recognized her handwriting on one of the top pages. Her journal entries. Somehow, he had copies. The realization hit hard. He hadn't just studied her, he'd taken her voice too. Erin asked about the papers, pretending curiosity. Julian said he'd made notes to track her growth. His calm tone masked ownership. Erin kept her expression neutral, though anger flickered underneath. He spoke about reflection and dependency, hinting that her progress was tied to him now. The words chilled her. She laughed lightly, pretending gratitude, while her mind raced. Her phone recorded every word. Julian didn't notice. He was too busy admiring his own creation, the broken, rebuilt version of Erin he believed he controlled. He didn't realize she was already dismantling the illusion from the inside out. After leaving, Erin sat in her car for a long time, gripping the steering wheel. The rain began again, tapping against the glass. She replayed the recording. Each word felt heavier, the calm cruelty behind them clearer. She knew this wasn't over. The police needed more than talk. They needed proof tied to the disappearances. She remembered the lake, the retreat cabin, and the photo of Denise on his desk. Somewhere among those memories was the evidence she needed. She made up her mind to return there. Not as a follower this time, but as a witness. Erin reached out to Marla, asking her to meet the next morning. But when she arrived at the cafe, Marla never showed. The waitress said no one had come by that name. Panic prickled in Erin's chest. She called Marla's number. Disconnected. She checked her email. Unread. Her mind raced. Either Marla had vanished willingly, or Julian had found out. The possibility froze her for a second. But then she steadied herself. Fear couldn't stop her now. If Julian had erased others before, then bringing him down wasn't just justice, it was survival. That evening, Erin noticed her apartment door slightly open when she returned. Inside, everything looked untouched. Yet something felt different. Her journal lay open on the table, turned to a blank page. A faint scent of honey lingered in the air. She didn't panic, she processed. Someone had been inside. She checked her files. Nothing missing. But when she opened the jar, the red thread she'd tied was gone. It wasn't theft, it was a message. Julian knew she was pulling away. He was warning her that he still had access, still control, and she was running out of time. Erin packed a small bag and drove toward the outskirts of town. She needed space to think away from his reach. She stayed at a roadside motel, curtains drawn, lights low. The air smelled like dust and rain. She spread her evidence across the bed, recordings, notes, reports, photos, everything connected. But it still wasn't enough. Somewhere one last piece was missing. She thought about the postcards she'd glimpsed in his office, the stack she hadn't examined closely. They might hold names or addresses. She knew what she had to do. She had to go back. The next day, Erin returned to the city, pretending everything was normal. She texted Julian saying she wanted closure and needed one final meeting to thank him. His reply came quickly, a smiling emoji, and a time. That night she walked into his apartment with steady steps. He looked pleased to see her, relaxed even. He poured her tea and spoke about gratitude and growth. Erin nodded, her phone recording again. She needed him comfortable, predictable. The words came easily now. She'd memorized the rhythm of his manipulation and could play along flawlessly. As he spoke, she noticed a framed photo on his desk, turned face down. Her curiosity flared. She asked if she could light a candle. While his back was turned, she flipped the photo over. Denise smiled from behind the glass. Erin froze, forcing her expression to remain calm when he turned back. She murmured something about how peaceful the room felt. Her voice didn't shake. But inside, every certainty solidified. This wasn't grief therapy, it was obsession disguised as healing. She had the proof now, but leaving with it alive was another question entirely. Julian walked her to the door, his tone warm. He said he was proud of her progress, that she'd reached the final stage. The words sounded ceremonial, almost rehearsed. Erin smiled, thanked him and stepped into the hallway. Once outside, she exhaled deeply, her mind racing with everything she'd seen. She texted herself a photo of Denise's picture before deleting it from her phone's gallery. The proof existed in cloud storage now, beyond his reach. But as she walked toward her car, a cold realization hit. She could feel someone watching from one of the apartment windows. That night, Erin couldn't sleep. She sat on the floor near the window, phone in hand. The street outside was empty except for a single parked car she didn't recognize. Its lights were off, but it hadn't moved in hours. She tried to convince herself it was coincidence, yet something in her gut disagreed. She messaged a detective contact she'd found online, explaining her suspicions without names. No reply came. The clock ticked loudly. Every second felt heavier. She decided then, she would stop running from fear. She would turn it into evidence. Erin woke up before dawn and drove to the police station. She handed over printed notes, recordings, photos, everything. The officer on duty promised to forward it to a detective. His polite tone didn't inspire confidence, but she'd done her part. As she stepped outside, the morning rain started again. It sounded almost rhythmic, steady against the pavement. She took it as a sign. Movement, progress, change. Still, the unease didn't lift. If Julian realized she'd exposed him, he wouldn't disappear quietly. He'd come for her. She just didn't know when or how. By the afternoon, Erin received a call from an unknown number. A man's voice said the evidence had been reviewed, and she should meet a detective at the station that evening. The call felt too quick, too neat, but she went anyway. When she arrived, the receptionist looked confused. No appointment, no record. Erin's stomach dropped. The call hadn't been from the police. Panic flared briefly, then settled into cold focus. She walked back to her car, scanning the parking lot. The same unmarked car from last night sat across the street. She drove away, keeping to side roads. Back home, she found another note slipped under her door. No words, just a single red thread tied in a knot. Erin stared at it for a long moment. The game wasn't over. Julian was warning her again, or maybe inviting her to the next move. She burned the thread in the sink, watching it curl into black smoke. Then she poured water over the ashes and whispered that this time she wasn't the one being hunted. She opened her journal, drew a line across the last page and wrote one word: trap. The next meeting would be hers. Erin contacted a friend who worked in it to install a location tracker app. She attached one device under Julian's car bumper that night. Her pulse stayed steady. The city was quiet, and no one seemed to notice her near his building. She drove away with calm determination. Every move had to be deliberate now. Julian might think she was scared, but she wasn't. She was building a case piece by piece, waiting for the moment everything collapsed around him. The only thing left was to make him believe she still belonged to him. She texted him late that night, saying she'd been thinking about the retreat, about how peaceful it felt by the lake. He replied almost instantly, saying peace could be found again if she was ready. She smiled at the screen. Her message short. Yes, I want that. Her hand trembled slightly. Not from fear but anticipation. The stage was set, the bait placed. Whatever happened next would decide whether she lived or became another silent name in his twisted version of healing. She turned off her phone and waited for the morning to arrive. The next morning, Julian sent her a message confirming the new retreat. The same cabin near the lake. Erin stared at the text for a long time before replying with a simple yes. She could feel the old fear creeping back, but she refused to feed it. She'd prepared for this moment. Every file, every recording, every note was backed up online and shared with 2 contacts. Even if she didn't return, Julian wouldn't get away again. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself that this time she wasn't walking into a trap, she was creating one. On the drive to the lake, the rain began to fall in steady lines across her windshield. The trees along the road leaned inward like silent witnesses. Julian's car followed ahead, his taillights glowing faintly through the mist. Erin's phone screen showed his trackers still active. Every few miles she imagined turning back, but she didn't. The lake had always symbolized endings in her dreams, but now it felt like a place for closure. She tightened her grip on the wheel, rehearsing her calm tone and every step of the plan she'd mapped out in her head. They arrived just before dusk. The cabin looked exactly the same. Same candles, same wooden table, same faint scent of honey mixed with smoke. Julian smiled warmly, as if nothing dark had ever touched this place. He told her this would be her final release session, the one that would free her completely. Erin nodded and unpacked her small bag, pretending trust. The silence between them felt loaded. He moved easily, confident, certain of his control. She followed his lead, her every movement measured, waiting for him to reveal what he'd hidden so carefully last time. Julian lit a fire in the small stone fireplace. He talked about renewal and acceptance, his tone smooth and deliberate. Erin watched him pour tea, the same kind he always used. She accepted the cup but didn't drink. Her attention stayed fixed on his eyes, searching for cracks in his calm. He asked her to start writing again. A final letter to her husband. Erin took the paper, pretending to follow his ritual. Her pen scratched slowly across the page, but instead of a goodbye, she wrote something else. Everything she'd learned about him, every lie he'd told. When she finished, Julian asked if she wanted to read it aloud. She handed it to him silently. He read the first lines, expecting vulnerability, but confusion crossed his face. His eyes flicked up toward hers. Erin's expression didn't change. He smiled faintly, but the warmth was gone. He set the paper aside and asked if she'd been researching. She said nothing, only tilted her head slightly. His jaw tightened. The control he'd held for so long began to slip, if only for a moment. Aaron recognized the shift. The hunter, realizing his prey, had turned around to face him. Julian tried to recover, speaking in that smooth therapist tone again. He said she was testing boundaries, part of the healing process. Aaron played along, pretending to soften. She said she wanted to understand more, the deeper meaning of his teachings. His ego flared instantly. He leaned closer, explaining his philosophy about loss and rebirth, about being chosen to guide the broken. Aaron nodded, encouraging him. Her phone, hidden inside her coat pocket, was recording everything. Each word revealed how much he believed his own delusion. Every sentence was another nail in the structure of his downfall. He moved around the cabin, pacing as he talked, passion rising in his voice. He said grief stripped people to their core, and only those strong enough could rebuild them. Aaron asked if Denise had been one of those people. The question landed hard. Julian froze, then smiled faintly, calling Denise a lesson in failure. Aaron stayed silent. He didn't notice her recording still running. He was too busy justifying himself, explaining how some people weren't ready, and how letting them go was mercy. Aaron felt a wave of cold clarity. He wasn't trying to heal anyone. As his voice grew louder, he poured more tea and handed her another cup. Aaron took it, but kept her fingers on the rim. She asked if he'd ever been afraid his methods would be misunderstood. He chuckled, saying the weak always misinterpret strength. His arrogance blinded him. Aaron slipped the cup slightly, spilling a few drops on the table. When she bent to wipe it, she discreetly pressed a small button on her phone to mark the recording timestamp. She needed one clear moment that tied his words to Denise's death, and now she had it. Julian sat back, crossing his arms. The smile on his face didn't reach his eyes anymore. He said she seemed distant lately, distracted, maybe even ungrateful. Aaron replied softly that sometimes healing required distance. His expression darkened. He stood and walked toward the window, staring out into the rain. He said the world outside didn't understand people like them, that they'd call what he did manipulation, not mercy. Aaron asked what he'd call it. He turned back, eyes hard. Purpose, he said. In that moment she saw him clearly. Not a healer, but a man who worshipped control. She rose quietly, pretending to stretch. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A notification from the tracker app. A signal had been sent, her backup plan active. Julian's attention snapped toward her. He asked who was contacting her. Aaron smiled, saying it was no one important. He walked closer, suspicion replacing calm. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming against the cabin roof. Aaron's mind sharpened. This was the moment everything balanced. One wrong move, and he'd realize the truth. She steadied her voice and asked if she could step outside to clear her thoughts. He hesitated, then nodded. Outside, the rain felt cold but grounding. Aaron took a deep breath and checked her phone under her jacket. The live recording had uploaded successfully. She felt relief for the first time in weeks. The sound of the distant bell carried across the lake, low and hollow. It reminded her of all the nights she'd heard it before. Warnings she hadn't listened to. She texted a single word to her contact. Proof. Then she turned back toward the cabin, ready to end this. The reflection of the fire flickered through the wet window like a heartbeat inside the dark. When she stepped back in, Julian was standing near the table, holding her bag. He'd found the phone charger and was looking at it curiously. Aaron kept her voice calm, saying she wanted to pack early. He didn't answer. His hand rested lightly on the folded letter she'd written about him. The fire crackled behind them, throwing shadows across his face. He asked if she'd ever considered that her grief had made her paranoid. Aaron said maybe, but paranoia had kept her alive so far. The sentence wasn't meant for him. It was for herself. He didn't like it. Julian's calm facade cracked again. He said trust was everything. that once it broke, healing became impossible. Aaron replied that trust required truth. He stepped closer, his tone soft but sharp. He told her she was close to understanding something bigger than herself. She smiled faintly and asked if that's what Denise said before she died. For the first time, he didn't answer immediately. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing. The silence stretched between them like a drawn wire. Aaron knew then she had him, cornered not by force but by his own need to be right. He turned away suddenly, grabbing a stack of papers from the desk. He threw them into the fire, the flames flaring bright. Aaron didn't move. She knew everything she needed was already backed up. Julian thought he was erasing evidence, but he was only revealing panic. His composure slipped fully now, words spilling fast about betrayal and how people always turned on him. Aaron let him rant, memorizing each sentence. When he finally stopped, his breathing uneven, she stepped closer and said softly that she wasn't like the others. She wanted to understand him. That calmed him instantly. Julian sat down heavily, as if the energy drained from his body. He said he'd made mistakes, but only wanted to help people see their strength. Aaron nodded slowly, encouraging him to talk. He confessed that some couldn't handle his methods, that fear ruined them before healing began. His voice lowered. Sometimes they wouldn't let go, he said. The words hung in the air like smoke. Aaron didn't react, though her heart clenched. She leaned slightly forward, her phone recording every syllable. That was the confession she needed. Quiet, indirect, but clear enough to destroy him. The storm outside intensified. Thunder rolled across the lake and the wind rattled the windows. Julian rose again, pacing, muttering about destiny and the weight of his work. Aaron stood near the door, calculating her next move. She didn't want to provoke him too soon. He turned suddenly, asking if she believed he could ever be forgiven. She said maybe, but not by her. His expression hardened instantly. He called her ungrateful, said she didn't deserve what he'd given her. The words weren't loud, but they cut deep. Aaron stepped back slightly, hand near the phone in her pocket. Julian's voice softened again, switching back to the charming tone he used on new group members. He said they could start over, erase everything, rebuild their connection from the beginning. Aaron nodded, pretending to consider it. Her mind replayed every warning sign she'd ignored. The honey jar, the red thread, the missing people. She told him she wanted one last exercise to prove her commitment. The suggestion caught him off guard, but he smiled, intrigued. He said, "Of course," and asked what she had in mind. Aaron looked toward the fire and said quietly, "Let's tell the truth." He asked what truth she meant. Aaron said the one about the people who never came back from his retreats. Julian's smile vanished. He said she was misunderstanding everything, twisting his words. She didn't argue. Instead, she placed her phone on the table, its screen faintly glowing. He glanced at it, suspicion flashing in his eyes. She told him the recording wasn't for the police. It was for him, so he could finally hear how he sounded when pretending to save people. He froze, torn between anger and confusion, unsure whether to destroy it or defend himself. Julian reached for the phone, but Aaron stepped in front of it. Her calmness unnerved him. He said she was making a mistake. She told him the mistake was ever trusting him. His face shifted from charm to rage in an instant. He shouted that she didn't understand the work, the sacrifice. Aaron stayed still, voice steady, saying he didn't heal people. He replaced them. For a moment, neither moved. The sound of the storm filled the space between them. Then Julian stepped back slowly, his expression unreadable. He smiled again, but this time it looked like defeat. He sat back down, eyes on the flames. "You think this will save you?" he asked quietly. Aaron said nothing. He said people like her always wanted control, always ran back to the pain because it gave them purpose. Aaron turned toward the door, hand on the knob. She told him that maybe he was right, but pain wasn't the problem anymore. he was. Then she opened the door and walked into the rain. Behind her the fire hissed, the wind howled, and the faint echo of the bell returned from across the lake. It sounded like freedom. Erin made it to her car and drove away fast, headlights slicing through sheets of rain. Her pulse was steady, her breathing even. She didn't look back until she reached the main road. Her phone buzzed with a message from the backup contact. The recordings had successfully uploaded to the shared folder. Relief hit her like a wave. She pulled over briefly, letting out a long breath. The lake shimmered faintly in the distance, the reflection of lightning dancing across its surface. She whispered a promise to the women who never escaped, that their story would. By morning, Erin was back in town. She stopped by the police station again, this time demanding to see a detective. When she handed over the new recordings, the officer's expression changed. They asked her to wait in a room while they made calls. She sat quietly, staring at the red thread she'd found tied around her wrist again. She didn't remember putting it there. Maybe she never removed it that night. She wrapped it tighter, as if to remind herself she'd survived the same thing that had taken so many before her. She wasn't prey anymore. The investigation began quickly. Detectives interviewed other group members, uncovering similar experiences. Missing person cases were reopened, timelines compared, evidence traced. Julian's name appeared again and again. Erin cooperated fully, giving every document, every recording. When the detectives thanked her for her courage, she nodded but didn't feel heroic. She only felt tired. That night, she went home and poured the last of the honey down the sink. The sticky gold twisted in the drain like memory being erased. She washed the jar and set it on the windowsill, empty, a symbol of something she'd finally let go of. A few days later, Erin received a message from an unknown number. It was short. "You're brave, but you don't know how deep it goes." No name, no context. She blocked the number immediately, though her chest tightened with unease. She didn't tell the police. She wanted this chapter closed. She sat by her window that evening, watching the rain return again. The sound of the bell came faintly through the air. This time it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like a reminder that survival wasn't about escaping pain but refusing to be defined by it. The next morning, Erin woke to the sound of her phone vibrating. A detective left a voicemail saying Julian Hart had been arrested at the cabin. Evidence matched multiple disappearances, including Denise's. Erin sat on the edge of her bed, listening twice before deleting the message. She didn't smile, didn't cry. She simply stood, opened the window, and let the cool air fill the room. The jar on the sill caught the light, empty but clean. For the first time in years, she felt ready to live, not as someone healing but as someone finally whole. News of Julian's arrest spread quickly. Local papers printed his photo beside headlines calling him a trusted grief counselor accused of manipulation and murder. Erin read every article but felt detached, like watching someone else's story. People from the group began reaching out, sharing messages of gratitude and disbelief. She replied politely but didn't engage. She wasn't ready to be anyone's symbol of survival. She'd done what she had to do. Beyond the news and the noise, all she wanted was quiet, the kind that came without fear, guilt, or the echo of his voice in her mind. The detectives asked Erin to visit the station once more for formal closure. They showed her a collection of recovered items from Julian's cabin: burnt letters, jewelry, and a half-melted candle holder. She recognized some pieces from women in the group. Seeing them felt heavier than hearing any confession. She asked what would happen to the victims' families. The detective said they'd be notified, and Erin could help if she wanted. She nodded, unsure if she could face their grief. Outside, rain started again, soft and steady. The world looked unchanged, yet something irreversible had shifted inside her. That night, Erin couldn't sleep. She walked through her apartment, touching familiar things: the framed photo of her husband, the empty honey jar, the notebook on her shelf. Each object felt like a small chapter of who she used to be. She realized grief hadn't left her. It had simply changed shape. It no longer hurt like it used to. It just existed, quiet and honest. She sat by the window listening to the city below and whispered that she was sorry for staying lost so long. The silence that followed didn't feel empty anymore. It felt peaceful. The next few weeks were slow but steady. Erin started cooking again, simple meals that filled her apartment with warmth. She reconnected with her sister, who came over with flowers and refused to leave until Erin laughed. For the first time, laughter didn't feel wrong. It felt like permission. They talked about ordinary things: recipes, neighbors, weekend plans. Life was returning in quiet ways. Still, Erin avoided looking at her phone too long, avoiding notifications about the trial. She didn't need to relive Julian's words through court transcripts. The truth was enough. She didn't need more proof. One afternoon, Erin visited the park near the community center. The benches were wet from a morning drizzle. She sat beneath a tree, watching people pass, couples holding hands, parents chasing toddlers, friends sharing stories. For a long time she'd seen grief as isolation, but now she recognized it in small ways around her. Everyone carrying something unseen. The realization brought her calm instead of sadness. She finally understood that loss didn't make her different. It made her human. She closed her eyes, feeling the breeze, and let herself breathe without measuring how it felt. Later, she passed by the same community center where everything began. The Healing Through Connection sign had been replaced by a new one. Community Support Network. Licensed counselors only. She stood at the doorway, remembering her first night there. How fragile and invisible she'd felt. The building looked brighter now, with new faces, new energy. She stepped inside briefly, greeted by a young woman who offered her a brochure. Erin smiled politely, saying she wasn't here for help, just to say thank you. The woman didn't understand, but Erin didn't explain. Some things didn't need words. Erin began volunteering quietly at a local shelter, organizing donation drives. Helping others felt natural, not forced. She didn't talk about what happened, but people often thanked her for her calm presence. She realized that empathy had always been her strength. Julian had only twisted it. Now she used it for something good. On her lunch breaks, she'd walk by the lake near town, the same one from her dreams. The water no longer frightened her. It shimmered softly under the sun, reflecting peace instead of loss. She started to think healing might not be a destination but a rhythm. One morning, a letter arrived with no return address. Inside was a small photo, a group picture from the early grief sessions. Everyone smiling, including Julian, standing at the back. On the back of the photo were 5 words written in neat handwriting. "We remember, and we see." There was no signature. Erin placed it in her drawer beside her husband's photo. She didn't know who sent it. Maybe one of the survivors. The gesture wasn't haunting, it was grounding. For once, memory didn't sting. It simply reminded her she wasn't alone in remembering. The day of the trial, Erin didn't attend. She stayed home, baking for the first time in years. The smell of warm bread filled the kitchen. She turned on the radio but kept the volume low. Every so often, updates about the case came through. The prosecutor described Julian's manipulation, his pattern of choosing widows, his belief that love could be rewritten through control. Erin listened quietly, her hands still covered in flour. When the announcer said the word guilty, she didn't cry. She only looked at the bread rising in the oven, steady and alive like time moving forward. After the verdict, reporters waited outside her building, but Erin slipped through the back alley unnoticed. She didn't want fame or recognition. Survival wasn't a headline, it was private. That evening she received a message from a detective saying the case had closed successfully, and her recordings were key evidence. Erin replied with a simple thank you. No more explanations, no more words about grief or courage. She made tea and sat near the window. The steam rose gently, fogging the glass. Outside, the city lights shimmered, steady and calm. The noise of the world no longer frightened her. A month later, Erin visited the cemetery for the first time in 2 years. She brought fresh flowers and a small note for her husband. She didn't read it aloud. She just let it rest against the gravestone. The ground was damp, but the air was clear. She whispered quietly that she was finally okay. It wasn't closure. It was acknowledgement. Grief no longer ruled her life. It lived beside her, quiet and small. As she walked away, she heard the faint sound of a church bell in the distance. For once, it sounded like blessing, not warning. Back home, Erin started a new notebook. On the first page she wrote, "Healing isn't forgetting, it's remembering without staying there." She didn't plan to fill the book with pain. This one would hold recipes, small goals, bits of joy. She wrote a list of things she wanted to try. Learn gardening, visit the coast, read new authors, maybe even travel again. Her handwriting felt steadier than before. The past didn't disappear, but it no longer dictated every move. The notebook wasn't a confession now. It was a promise. One she was ready to keep. That weekend she joined a small reading club in her neighborhood. During introductions, people shared small stories about their lives. When it was her turn, she simply said she'd been through some hard years but was grateful to be here. No one pressed for details. The group laughed, talked about books, and made plans for next week. Erin left with a light heart, carrying a paperback in the warmth of ordinary connection. The kind that didn't demand healing or transformation, just presence. For the first time, she realized she'd stopped thinking about what she'd lost and started living again. Occasionally, the memories of Julian surfaced. His voice, his calm smile, his words disguised as care. But the power they once held was gone. Erin could see them for what they were now, manipulation dressed as kindness. She didn't feel anger anymore, only understanding. People like him thrived on silence, and she had taken that silence away. That was enough. When she caught her reflection in the mirror one evening, she saw someone steady, capable, and alive. She no longer looked like a victim or a student of grief. She looked like herself again. One night she returned to the same cafe where she and Marla had last planned together. It had new owners now, new decor, but the same view of the street. She ordered coffee and sat by the window watching people pass. On the table beside her lay a notebook someone had left behind, filled with half-finished thoughts. She smiled softly, closing it and giving it to the barista. People came and went, lives overlapping for brief moments. She realized the beauty in that, how everyone carried stories unseen. That thought, more than anything, made her feel at peace. The next morning, Erin woke early and took a walk by the lake. Mist floated above the water, pale and gentle. Birds skimmed the surface, breaking the silence. She stood there, remembering the fear she'd once felt in this place. It was strange how something so terrifying could later feel serene. She knelt by the shore and dropped a small red thread into the water, the last one she'd kept. It drifted away quietly, carried by the current. She didn't need reminders anymore. Her survival didn't depend on holding on. It depended on learning to release. In the weeks that followed, Erin began teaching journaling workshops at the community center. People came from different walks of life, some grieving, some lost, others just curious. She told them not to chase healing but to notice it in small ways, through smells, sounds, small kindnesses. Her sessions became popular not because of lessons but because she listened. After class one day, a young widow thanked her for helping her sleep again. Erin smiled gently and said, "Healing always begins when you stop trying to prove you're fine." The woman nodded, tears soft but grateful. At home that evening, Erin found herself smiling at the smallest things, the smell of tea, the sound of rain, the faint hum of traffic outside. She opened the window and let the air in. On her counter, the empty honey jar caught the light again. She decided to fill it with wildflowers instead. The colors brought life to the room. She realized she wasn't avoiding the past anymore. She was reshaping it. Every scar, every memory, every lesson, They'd all become part of something she could finally call her own story, not his. A month later, a documentary about the case aired on local television. Friends asked if she'd watch it, but she didn't. She turned off her phone and spent the evening cooking, humming softly. Some stories didn't need to be relived. They'd already been rewritten by survival. She wasn't interested in hearing his name again, or reliving the fear. Instead, she set the table for one, poured herself a cup of tea and ate slowly, appreciating each bite. It felt like a quiet celebration, not of victory, but of peace. That was more than enough for her. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, Erin found her first letter to her husband, the one she'd written before ever meeting Julian. The paper was yellowed, but the words still clear. She read it slowly, realizing she'd been searching for closure long before she understood what it meant. She placed it back in the drawer, smiling faintly. Some love stories don't end, they just change shape. Her husband would have wanted her to live again, not linger in pain. For the first time, she felt she'd finally honored that wish. Erin began taking photography walks on weekends, capturing small details. Reflections on puddles, children chasing pigeons, flowers breaking through cracks in sidewalks. Each photo felt like proof of quiet beauty returning to her life. She printed a few and hung them on her walls. Her apartment no longer looked like a museum of grief. It looked lived in. The light through the windows felt softer now. Every corner carried signs of renewal. She realized peace didn't come from escaping darkness, it came from learning to exist gently within the light that followed. Weeks passed, and spring arrived. The air smelled of rain and earth. Erin visited the park again, sitting by the same bench as before. This time she wasn't watching others heal. She was part of life's ordinary rhythm again. A little girl nearby was feeding birds, her laughter bright. The sound carried across the air, blending with the faint toll of a bell from a nearby church. Erin smiled, not startled by it. It reminded her how far she'd come, from fear to stillness, from silence to understanding. She finally felt like she belonged in the world again. That evening, she received an email from another survivor group inviting her to speak. She hesitated at first, unsure if she was ready to share publicly. But something inside her said it wasn't about reliving pain, it was about reclaiming her story. She replied, yes. When the day came, she stood in a small hall, telling the audience how grief can make you forget yourself, and how kindness, even self-kindness, can bring you back. There was no dramatization, no tragedy, just honesty. People listened quietly, some crying softly. Erin's voice didn't shake once. After the talk, a woman approached her and said she'd lost her husband last year. Erin held her hand and told her not to rush healing. The woman asked how Erin knew when it was time to start living again. Erin said, "When you stop asking permission." The woman smiled through tears. Erin walked outside, the evening sun painting everything gold. The world didn't look perfect, but it looked possible. She realized she'd turned the darkest chapter of her life into something that helped others find light. That was more powerful than any justice could ever be. That night, Erin returned home, poured herself a glass of water, and stood by the window. The city lights glowed softly, the streets alive with quiet movement. She felt calm, grounded, complete. On the table, the wild flowers in the honey jar had begun to wilt slightly, their colors fading but still beautiful. She didn't replace them. She let them stay as they were, proof that beauty didn't have to last forever to matter. Erin whispered a thank you to the silence around her, not to anyone in particular, but to the peace she'd finally found within herself. Weeks turned into months, and Erin's life settled into quiet rhythm. She taught workshops, met friends for coffee, and filled her days with small, meaningful moments. Sometimes strangers recognized her from the trial coverage, but she never liked being called a survivor. She preferred the word living. Survival felt like looking backward. Living meant she'd moved beyond the storm. On rainy nights, She'd still hear the faint echo of a bell somewhere in the distance, but now it brought her comfort instead of fear, a reminder that even endings can sound like renewal. One afternoon, Erin visited the lake again. The water was calm, glassy under a pale sky. She brought wild flowers and scattered them into the shallows, watching as they floated away. Each bloom drifted differently. Some sank quickly, others held on a little longer. She thought of the women who never got to see this peace. She whispered their names softly, letting them disappear with the ripples. It wasn't mourning anymore. It was remembrance. For the first time, the lake didn't feel haunted. It felt like a place where stories ended so that others could begin. Later, she stopped by the small diner near town, the one she and her husband used to visit. The same waitress still worked there, smiling when she recognized her. Erin sat at their old booth, ordered his favorite meal and ate slowly. The taste was familiar and comforting. She didn't cry. Instead, she smiled faintly, realizing love could stay alive even when the people we love couldn't. The memory didn't hurt anymore. It simply sat beside her, quiet and warm, like an old friend who no longer needed to speak to be understood. When she left the diner, the air smelled of rain again. Drops began to fall, tapping softly on her umbrella. The sound reminded her of those long nights, trapped in grief, when she thought she'd never feel safe again. But this rain was different. Lighter, gentler. She walked slowly through it, unafraid of getting wet. Every raindrop felt like permission to keep moving forward. She didn't look over her shoulder or think of who she used to be. The world didn't owe her peace anymore. She had built it herself, one step, one breath, one truth at a time. A few weeks later, Erin received a letter from the court confirming Julian's sentence, life imprisonment with no chance of parole. She folded the paper neatly and placed it in a drawer without reading it twice. Justice mattered, but it wasn't what healed her. He was gone, but she remained. That was victory enough. She looked around her apartment, the flowers, the photos, the soft light, and realized it finally felt like home again. Every object, once a reminder of pain, now stood as proof of endurance. Her world wasn't perfect, but it was hers again. Erin began helping the police connect other women who had been part of similar support circles across the state. She listened to their stories, some eerily similar to her own. They spoke of guilt, confusion, and misplaced trust. Erin didn't give them advice. She gave them space. One woman said she felt broken. Erin told her healing doesn't mean forgetting the damage. It means learning to live with the cracks. They both cried quietly. For the first time, Erin understood what purpose felt like. Not the false one Julian preached, but the kind that helped others rebuild. She created a small online group called The Second Light. It wasn't about therapy or guidance. It was about listening. People joined from all over, sharing losses, fears, and small victories. Erin moderated gently, never positioning herself as a teacher. She'd post reflections sometimes about cooking again, about laughing unexpectedly, about seeing the good in ordinary days. Her words weren't dramatic, they were simple. Still, they spread fast, reaching people who needed to hear them. Each message felt like a ripple in the lake, quiet but lasting, proof that healing could travel farther than pain ever did. On the anniversary of her husband's passing, Erin spent the day at home. No candles, no sadness. She cooked his favorite dinner and played the song they danced to at their wedding. The apartment filled with soft music and the smell of rosemary and butter. She sat by the window afterward, eating alone but not lonely. The city lights shimmered below, and she found herself smiling. Love, she realized, doesn't disappear. It changes shape and stays in the smallest places. A flavor, a sound, a quiet evening, when the world finally feels gentle again. That night she dreamed of the lake once more. In the dream, the water was still, reflecting the moon perfectly. On the shore stood the women who'd vanished, their faces calm, their hands folded. They didn't speak or move. They just looked at her with quiet gratitude. When she woke, her pillow was damp with tears, but she didn't feel pain. It felt like closure, a final goodbye she hadn't known she needed. She whispered a thank you into the darkness, unsure if anyone could hear. Some farewells, she thought, only happen in silence, and that's enough. The next morning, Erin decided to move. Not far, just to a new apartment closer to the park. She wanted sunlight, noise, and the sight of people passing every day. The act of packing didn't feel like running. It felt like stepping into a new chapter. She left behind the old curtains, the worn-out chair, even the old photograph frames. She kept only her notebooks, the empty honey jar, and a single photo of her husband. Everything else belonged to a life she had already outgrown. She was ready to begin again, lighter than she'd ever been before. Her new place was small but bright. Sunlight streamed through wide windows, touching every corner. Erin filled it with plants, books, and little reminders of peace. Seashells, postcards, dried flowers. The first night there, she slept soundly without dreams. When she woke, the air smelled of rain and birds sang outside. She made tea, poured it into her favorite cup, and stood by the window. The bell from a nearby church rang softly, its tone familiar yet new. She didn't flinch or turn away. Instead, she smiled, whispering to herself, "It's just a sound now, nothing more." Over time, the Second Light group grew into a small foundation offering resources for people recovering from manipulation and loss. Erin never sought recognition. She just wanted to make sure others never felt as isolated as she once did. Sometimes she'd receive messages saying her story gave others courage. She always replied with the same line. It wasn't courage. It was survival. And survival is enough. The foundation became her quiet legacy, one built not from revenge but from resilience. Through it, she gave every shattered story a chance to find its own ending. One afternoon, a journalist visited to write an article about her work. She asked Erin what she'd learned from everything that happened. Erin thought for a while before answering. She said she learned that control can look like care, and love can disguise harm, but truth always waits underneath. The journalist nodded, moved. When the article was published, the headline read, "From Grief to Grace, One Woman's Quiet Revolution." Erin smiled at that, not because it sounded heroic, but because it captured something real. The grace of simply continuing. That had always been the hardest part. A year passed before Erin returned to the community center. The staff had changed, and the building felt unfamiliar. But when she entered the hall, the air carried the same soft hum of human voices. A new counselor greeted her, asking if she'd come for the session. Erin said no. She just wanted to donate some notebooks for new attendees. As she placed them on the table, she noticed one small jar of honey among the refreshments. The sight made her pause, then smile. Not everything from the past was a wound. Some things could be reclaimed. As she left the center, the afternoon sun was bright, turning the pavement golden. She walked slowly, enjoying the warmth. For years, grief had made her rush through moments like this, afraid they'd slip away. Now she let them linger. The sound of children laughing nearby drifted through the air, followed by the scent of jasmine from a garden fence. Every detail felt alive. She thought about how pain once ruled her world, and now it was just a story, one that had taught her what peace looked like when it finally arrived. That evening, Erin invited a few friends from her workshop over for dinner. The table was full of laughter, conversation, and mismatched plates. It wasn't a celebration of survival. It was just life, ordinary and good. Someone mentioned how storms had hit hard that week, and Erin said rain never frightened her anymore. She looked around the table at all the faces, different people, different stories, all still standing. She realized how powerful it was to simply be among them, not as a teacher or victim, but as one of many finding warmth after long winters. After everyone left, Erin cleaned up slowly, humming softly to herself. She noticed how quiet the apartment felt afterward, but it wasn't lonely. She opened the window and let the cool night air in. On the sill the honey jar still sat, now filled with dried petals. It caught the moonlight gently. She touched it once, smiling. Some reminders didn't need to be erased. They needed to be transformed. She closed the window, feeling the peace of closure settle in her chest. She'd carried her pain long enough. Now it could rest too. The next morning she wrote a letter. Not to her husband or Julian, but to herself. She wrote about the version of her who had walked into that first grief meeting, lost and fragile. She thanked her for surviving long enough to become this woman. Steady, grounded, free. She folded the letter neatly and placed it in her journal. No tears came, only quiet gratitude. It wasn't a goodbye. It was recognition of everything she'd endured, and everything she'd built afterward. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting back. It's forgiving yourself for once needing saving. Days later, Erin sat in the park, notebook in hand. She watched sunlight scatter through the trees and the breeze ripple across the grass. She started writing again. Not about loss, but about life. Small details. The color of the sky, the laughter of strangers, the way the light touched everything. Her words were simple, honest, unplanned. She realized that storytelling wasn't always about tragedy. Sometimes it was about the quiet persistence of joy. She smiled to herself, closing the notebook. The world felt wide again, open and forgiving. She was finally ready to live without fear. That night she dreamed of her husband one last time. He stood at the end of a pier, smiling softly. He didn't speak. He just nodded, like someone satisfied with what he saw. Erin didn't reach for him. She just stood still, returning the smile. When she woke, morning light filled the room. It felt warm, not heavy. She whispered thank you into the air, unsure if it was for him or herself. Either way, it felt right. The dream didn't ache, it comforted. It was the kind of closure that doesn't end anything, only brings peace. Months later, Erin hosted a small exhibition of her photography. Simple moments of light, rain, and reflection. Each picture told a quiet story of renewal. Visitors lingered, commenting on how peaceful the photos felt. Erin walked among them, calm and present. A woman approached her, saying the images felt like breathing again after being underwater. Erin smiled, realizing she had captured exactly that feeling, the first breath after darkness. She didn't tell the woman what inspired them. Some stories, she believed, didn't need explaining. Their beauty was in what they allowed others to feel. After the exhibition, Erin took a late walk through the city. Lights shimmered in puddles and distant thunder rolled, soft and harmless. She didn't rush. Every reflection in the street felt like a version of her past self, still there, but quieter, fading into the rhythm of life. She thought about the women whose stories ended early, and promised she'd keep theirs alive through kindness. That was her vow now, to honor them not with mourning, but with living fully. The storm clouds cleared slowly, revealing a faint pale moon. It looked like forgiveness hanging in the sky. When she returned home, the air smelled faintly of rain and tea. She poured herself a cup, sat by the window, and looked at the empty streets below. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to fill the quiet. Silence had once terrified her, now it was peace itself. The honey jar glowed faintly in the lamplight, its petals golden and dry. She realized grief hadn't left her. It had simply changed its voice. It spoke now through gratitude, through presence, through stillness, and for the first time she didn't just survive the night. She lived it. The next morning, sunlight poured across her floor. Erin opened the window wide, breathing in fresh air. The world outside felt bright and alive, full of possibility. She picked up her camera and headed toward the park, her steps light. Every sound, the hum of traffic, the bell from the church, the laughter in the distance felt like music. For years she'd searched for healing in others. Now she understood it had always lived quietly inside her, waiting to be noticed. She smiled to herself, walking toward the light, with calm certainty. Nothing could take that again. As the day ended, Erin stood by the lake one final time. The sky burned orange, fading into violet. She placed her camera beside her and just watched the water move. In its reflection she saw not loss but life, rippling, imperfect, beautiful. The sound of the bell rang faintly once more, distant but clear. She closed her eyes and listened, feeling the warmth of the evening air. Everything she'd lost, everything she'd feared, had led her here, to stillness, to peace, to herself. And in that moment, Erin knew she was finally free.